Black is such a happy color. Now, remember, my dear, in all your relationships with boys, you must be shy and modest.
Yes, Mother.
Watch things hand closely the next time Professor Altshuler calls the Addams house. It hangs up the phone. It passes Morticia her mail. And it's the wrong hand. For decades, fans assumed nobody caught it. They were wrong. The truth is stranger than a simple mistake, and it says something about how television used to get made that modern shows would never risk. A crew this small, working this fast, left it in on purpose. Or did they just never notice? Either way, it's still sitting there in the footage, unedited, 60 years later, waiting for you to see it. So look again. This is what actually happened, and it's only the first thing this show got away with. The hand that gave itself away. In the episode where two investigators mistake the Addams family for aliens, agents from a fictional bureau of mysterious space objects show up during a midnight picnic, convinced Gomez and Morticia might be Martians. The confusion escalates fast, right up until Thing answers the telephone for a very confused Professor Altshuler. Then it hands Morticia her mail. Watch those two shots back to back. The hand is left-handed. Every other appearance of Thing across the entire series, it's a right hand. Nobody fixed it. Nobody reshot it. It just runs, uncorrected, exactly as filmed in 1965. And it's been running that way in reruns ever since. Here's the part most fans never learn. Thing wasn't a prop. It was actor Ted Cassidy, lying flat on a rolling trolley hidden beneath the floorboards, feeding his arm up through a Bach on cue. He played Lurch in the same episodes. He played Thing, too. The only time he didn't was in the rare shots where both characters needed to appear together, and an associate producer stepped in to double for him, sliding under the same trolley the moment Cassidy needed to be standing upright as Lurch instead. Cassidy was naturally right-handed, and that's the hand Thing used almost every time. But every so often, he switched to his left, deliberately, according to people who worked on set, just to see if anyone was paying close enough attention to notice. Almost nobody did. Not at the time, anyway. It took decades of reruns and frame-by-frame rewatching for the switch to become common knowledge among fans who'd seen the show 100 times. Even the character's own credit hid the joke in plain sight. At the end of every single episode, Thing was billed simply as itself, never as Ted Cassidy, an in-house wink that let the mystery stay intact for years. That single detail tells you almost everything about how this production actually worked behind the scenes. It wasn't polished. It wasn't careful. It was improvised, physical, and held together by people making things up as they filmed, which is exactly the kind of energy that built the entire show in the first place, starting with the fact that none of these characters even had names yet. The family nobody had bothered to name. Charles Addams had been drawing this family for over 2 decades before television came calling, and in every single cartoon, not one of them had a name. Not the father, not the mother, not the children. They were simply the family to New Yorker readers, recognizable by silhouette alone. The first real push to name them actually came a couple of years before the show existed, when a toy company wanted to license a doll collection based on the cartoons and needed something to print on the packaging. When a network finally wanted to build a full series around them, somebody had to sit down and finish the job, naming 5 people basically from scratch under a deadline. For the daughter, Addams reportedly got the idea from a friend, a poet named Joan Blake, at a party where he mentioned he still needed a name for the little girl and was feeling low that evening himself. She suggested a line from an old nursery rhyme called Monday's Child, one that gives every day of the week its own personality, going back at least as far as the 1830s. Wednesday's child, the poem says, is full of woe. That line became a name, and the name became a defining trait. Her full name ended up being Wednesday Friday Addams. A small joke buried inside the same poem, since Friday's child, in most versions of the rhyme, is loving and giving. The father almost went a different direction entirely. Addams suggested two options, Gomez or Rapelli, and left the final call to the actor who'd be playing him. John Aston picked Gomez. It's hard now to imagine the character working under the other name, but for a while, it genuinely could have gone either way. The son had the closest call of all. Addams originally wanted to call him Hubert, and the studio said no almost immediately, worried it sounded too suggestive for family television in the 1960s. They landed on Pugsley instead. Hubert didn't disappear completely, though. It resurfaced decades later as the name of the family's newest baby in the 1993 film Addams Family Values. Proof that even a rejected joke eventually finds its way back into the story. Naming 5 strangers in a matter of weeks turned out to be the easy part, and Addams didn't even do it entirely alone. He worked closely with David Levy, the show's creator and a former network programming executive, to lock the final list in before cameras ever rolled, the two of them going back and forth on which options actually sounded like a real family rather than a cartoonist's private joke. Levy pitched the whole project to the press around the same time with a specific promise attached. These were meant to be full-bodied, sympathetic people rather than grotesque monsters, a deliberate attempt to protect the spirit of Addams's original cartoons rather than cheapen them for a laugh track. Getting the show to actually sound like something worth watching took a very different kind of gamble, and it started with a composer nobody wanted to pay properly. The theme nobody could afford to record right. Vic Mizzy wrote the melody first, built around a harpsichord that gave the whole thing an antique, slightly unsettling flavor before a single lyric was added. He already had the finger snaps mapped out in his head too, a percussion track that cost nothing and needed no musicians at all. Then came the words, and with them, a much bigger problem. The production company, Filmways, didn't want to pay for a group of singers to record the vocal, so Mizzy sang it himself. All of it. He layered his own voice on top of itself 3 separate times to fake the sound of multiple vocalists trading lines, a trick nobody watching at home could tell from a real trio. During the same session, Ted Cassidy leaned into his deep lurch voice and dropped in the words neat, sweet, and petite between the lyrics, an ad-libbed touch that stuck permanently in the final mix. Even the closing instrumental, played over the credits at the end of every episode, was built the same cheap and clever way, using nothing more than a triangle, a wooden block, a siren whistle, and a duck call instead of a full studio orchestra. The song never charted nationally when it was released as a single. That part barely mattered. Decades later, it's one of the most recognized 4 seconds of music in American television, still played at basketball arenas to rally a home crowd. Still instantly identifiable from nothing but a few finger snaps. Still hummed by people who've never watched a single full episode of the show. It came from. Mizzy went on to write the theme for Green Acres the following year, but the Addams tune stayed his signature piece for the rest of his life, the one obituary writers led with when he died decades later. A composer working around a budget he didn't control ended up creating something no orchestra could have improved on. The same scrappy energy shaped almost every casting decision behind the camera, starting with an actor who showed up to audition for the wrong role entirely. The actor who tried out for the wrong part. John Astin wasn't looking to play a family patriarch. He'd studied at Johns Hopkins University years earlier, and it was there that he first came across Charles Addams's original cartoons long before he had any reason to think he'd one day play one of the characters. Producers called him in after strong buzz from a film he'd made with James Garner called The Wheeler Dealers. And when he arrived, he read for Lurch, the towering, near-silent butler. It didn't land. The producers thought he was wrong for the part. What he was right for, they realized almost immediately, was Gomez, and the rest of his career followed from that redirect. Decades later, Astin returned to Johns Hopkins as a professor, credited by the university with reviving its theater program. A full circle nobody could have predicted from that first audition. Lurch went to Ted Cassidy instead, a 6'9" former Texas radio announcer with almost no acting credits to his name, a height that had made him an obvious pick for unusual character parts for years before this show came along. The character was written to be completely mute, a silent presence, answering doors and ringing gongs. During the filming of the pilot, the moment came for Lurch's first entrance, and Cassidy improvised 2 words in a deep, deliberate voice. "You rang." The room burst out laughing. Producers rewrote the character on the spot to let him actually speak, and that ad-libbed line became his signature for the rest of his career. Astin himself admitted years later that he'd walked into the whole production skeptical he could actually do justice to material this specific, worried that Charles Addams's sensibility was too particular to translate into a weekly sitcom format. It translated anyway, largely because nobody involved treated the source material as a joke to rush through. Morticia came together differently. Carolyn Jones wasn't a struggling actress hoping for any part she could get. She'd already earned an Academy Award nomination for a film called The Bachelor Party, shared the screen with Elvis Presley in King Creole, and won a Golden Globe of her own, all before television ever crossed her mind as a serious option. Taking a weekly sitcom role was, if anything, a step down on paper for someone with her resume. She was already a devoted fan of Charles Addams's original cartoons before the show existed too. Addams personally wanted her for the role, and the 2 of them became genuine friends during production. With some of her own ideas about Morticia's dry humor making it directly into the scripts, including the running joke about which side of the family Cousin It belonged to. Astin later pushed hard to make the marriage between Gomez and Morticia feel like a real, physical romance, rather than the sexless TV pairings audiences were used to at the time, complete with tango dancing and a habit of Gomez kissing his way up her arm whenever she spoke French. Network executives pushed back more than once, uncomfortable with a married couple showing that much visible affection on a family program. Astin kept it in anyway, and the chemistry became one of the show's most talked-about qualities among fans who'd never seen a husband and wife act quite that openly smitten with each other on television before. The children came from far less experienced places. Ken Weatherwax had made his first on-camera appearance years earlier as a child model in a Gleam toothpaste commercial, cast at around 6 or 7 years old before he'd ever set foot on a scripted set. He also happened to be the nephew of Ruby Keeler, the famous 1930s dance star, and of the family that trained the original Lassie, which meant show business ran through both sides of his family before he ever auditioned for anything himself. Lisa Loring, cast as Wednesday, had been modeling since age 3 and was chosen partly because she resembled Carolyn Jones closely enough to look like her real daughter. She was 5 years old and couldn't read yet, so she memorized every line by having them read aloud to her first, twice through. before repeating them back word for word at her audition, a skill she leaned on for the entire run of the series. Then there was Cousin It, played by a performer named Felix Silla, who walked into an open casting call and was handed the role on the spot. No audition required, no lines to read, nothing to prove beyond being the right size for a costume that hadn't even been fitted yet. Every one of these people, professional or brand new, ended up carrying a show that was racing against a rival almost nobody remembers was ever a threat in the first place. The rival show and the borrowed mansion, 6 days. That's how close together the Addams Family and the Munsters premiered in September of 1964. 2 black-and-white sitcoms about unusual families airing on competing networks within the same week, both built around a similar bait and switch. A family that looked horrifying on paper but behaved with total warmth toward each other. Television historians who've researched both shows in depth don't think that timing was an accident at all. 2 separate studios landed on nearly identical concepts in the same development season, and neither one blinked. Both shows scrambled to look distinct from each other once they realized what they were up against. They avoided booking the same guest stars whenever possible. John Astin argued in interviews that the 2 concepts weren't even similar, insisting the Munsters looked like monsters but behaved like an ordinary family, while the Addamses looked completely normal and behaved like nothing of the sort. Audiences mostly didn't care about the distinction. The Munsters actually pulled slightly higher ratings across the head-to-head run, and the Addams Family only cracked the top 30 shows on television during its first season before slipping out of that range in its second. To the general public, the 2 shows blurred together anyway, remembered decades later almost as a matched set rather than 2 competing productions that had gone to real lengths to avoid looking alike. Both shows ran for exactly 2 seasons before cancellation, and both ultimately lost their audience to the same culprit: the campy new superhero series Batman, which stole the exact demographic both spooky sitcoms had been fighting over. Behind the Addams set, the budget crunch showed up in stranger ways than casting. Building an entire Gothic mansion from scratch would have cost more than the show could justify, so the studio, MGM, repurposed leftover interior sets from a movie that had just wrapped a few months earlier, The Unsinkable Molly Brown. The famously dark, shadowy Addams living room wasn't actually dark at all in person. It was painted bright pink and teal, with gold trim and pale yellow curtains, colors chosen specifically because black and white film would render them as convincing shades of gray. The trick didn't stop at the walls either. To get exactly the right shade of gray on camera, makeup artists sometimes painted the actors' own faces in equally strange, outlandish tones nobody would ever see accurately outside a black and white broadcast. A giant stuffed tortoise and a mounted swordfish head rounded out the decor, pulled from whatever MGM's prop warehouse had lying around that looked remotely haunted. Even the exterior shots came from somewhere unexpected. A real Los Angeles mansion that stood in for the Addams house until it was demolished in 1967, gone for good less than a year after the show itself ended. One more detail from that mansion made television history almost by accident. The Addams Family owned the very first home computer ever shown on a scripted American series, a fictional machine called the Univac, sitting in plain view in the den as though every household might reasonably own one someday. A few years later, Batman's Bruce Wayne would get his own version in the Batcave, built on the same underlying design. A show assembled from recycled sets and a stretched budget still managed to predict a piece of television's future, which says something about how much genuine ingenuity was hiding behind the corner cutting. That same scrappiness showed up on the actors themselves, sometimes in ways that were genuinely uncomfortable to sit through. The costumes nobody wanted to wear twice. Felix Silla's Cousin It costume started out built from real human hair, an authentic choice that turned out to be a serious liability once anyone remembered how many people smoked on a 1960s television set. Real hair around lit cigarettes was a fire risk waiting to happen, so the production eventually switched to a fire-retardant synthetic instead. And even that version was heavy enough to leave Silla sweating through takes under the studio lights. Even after the swap, Silla could barely see through the finished costume and mostly relied on instructions to simply walk in whatever direction he was pointed, letting his dubbed-in voice do the rest of the acting from a recording booth after filming Wrapped. He wasn't credited on screen for years, and most viewers had no idea a real performer was inside that mass of hair at all. Ken Weatherwax had a different problem entirely. He was allergic to the 100% wool his costumes were made from. Badly enough that his mother ended up buying his on-screen wardrobe herself just to avoid the irritation, checking every fabric by hand before it ever reached the set. A show built around a family of outcasts ended up quietly accommodating a real child's allergies behind the scenes every single week. Carolyn Jones's Morticia gown created its own kind of misery, just not a medical one. Designer Nolan Miller, who would go on to become one of Hollywood's most sought-after costume designers on shows like Dynasty decades later, called this the single hardest costume he ever built in his career. And he had to construct 30 identical copies of the same dress for stunt work and off-camera continuity, since one torn seam could otherwise shut down a whole day of filming. Getting into the full look, wig, makeup, and the narrow dress itself took Jones roughly 2 hours every single time before a scene could even begin. Getting back out of just the dress alone ate up another 20 minutes on its own, a routine she repeated for 2 full seasons without complaint. Even Gomez's trademark cigar came with hidden cost. It wasn't only a character quirk. It was paid product placement for an actual cigar brand. Dutch Masters worked into nearly every episode as a visible prop, rather than an incidental detail. John Aston had a habit of stubbing the cigars out directly on his own breast pocket for the bit, a small piece of physical comedy that became one of Gomez's most recognizable tics. To stop him from literally catching fire on camera, the wardrobe department lined the inside of his suit jacket with asbestos, a standard flame-resistant material at the time that nobody thought twice about using that way in 1964. None of these actors were suffering through anything close to the real hardship carried by one specific castmate, a performer whose own childhood had already been shaped by a far more serious kind of exploitation decades before he ever set foot on this set. The child star who rewrote the law before playing Uncle Fester. Jackie Coogan, who played Uncle Fester, had been one of the biggest child stars in the history of American film long before the Addams family existed. He worked directly with Charlie Chaplin as a small child, co-starring in The Kid in 1921, and followed it the next year with the title role in Oliver Twist. Between those 2 roles alone, he was arguably the most recognizable child performer on the planet, appearing in nearly 20 films before he turned 18. His face ended up on dolls, stationery, and merchandise across the country, the kind of ever-present branding modern audiences would recognize instantly. Estimates put his total childhood earnings somewhere between $3 and $4 million, an enormous fortune for the era, worth tens of millions in today's money. Under California law at the time, none of that money legally belonged to him. It belonged to his parents, which was standard practice across the entire industry at the time and rarely questioned by anyone in a position to challenge it. His father managed the funds directly until a car accident took his life in the spring of 1935, just months before Jackie turned 21. His mother and his stepfather, Arthur Bernstein, took over control of what remained, and Bernstein also happened to already be the family's own lawyer and financial advisor. A conflict of interest nobody had the power to challenge at the time. What was left turned out to be far less than expected. Coogan had been living on a weekly allowance of $6.25 the entire time his fortune supposedly sat waiting for him. When he finally sued his mother and stepfather in 1938 to recover what he believed was rightfully his, the law genuinely wasn't on his side. After legal costs, he ended up with roughly $126,000 of the $250,000 still remaining, a fraction of what he'd actually earned as a child. At one particularly desperate point during the fight, he reportedly turned to Chaplin himself for help, and Chaplin handed him cash without a second thought. His case became public enough and outrageous enough that California lawmakers acted. The following year, the state passed the California Child Actors Bill, still known informally today as Coogan's Law, requiring a portion of any child performer's earnings to be protected in a trust fund the parents couldn't simply spend. It remains on the books, modified over the decades, protecting child actors, working right now. Suing his own family cost Coogan more than money, too. His stepfather was well connected across the industry, and for roughly 8 years afterward, from 1939 to 1947, Coogan couldn't land a single screen role, forced instead to rebuild whatever career he could on stage. Television eventually gave him the second chance film work never did, and by the time casting began on the Addams Family, the lawsuit that once made him unemployable had become old news to a whole new generation of viewers who only knew him as the bald uncle who lit light bulbs in his own mouth for laughs. Decades after his own case closed, that same man carried a piece of entertainment history onto a low-budget spooky sitcom that had nothing to do with ghosts or comedy at all. It's the kind of detail that makes the whole show feel far less disposable than its 2-season run and modest ratings would suggest. And it's exactly the kind of legacy that explains why this family never actually left television for good. What actually got left in, and why it still matters. Come back to that hand for a second. Things switching from right to left in the middle of a scene wasn't a mistake anyone panicked over. Nobody scrambled to reshoot it. Nobody cut around it in the editing room. It simply aired, week after week, in reruns for 6 decades, hiding in plain sight until fans with rewind buttons and freeze frames started noticing. That's really the whole story of this show in miniature. A recycled mansion painted the wrong colors on purpose. A theme song one man faked into sounding like 3. A butler who wasn't supposed to talk until an actor couldn't help himself. A cast pulled together from toothpaste commercials, open casting calls, and one genuinely brutal piece of Hollywood history nobody expected to walk through the door. None of it was engineered to be perfect. All of it somehow worked anyway. Most of that same cast came back together one more time in 1977 for a reunion television movie, sharing the screen again years after cancellation, before age and illness eventually took the originals one by one. The theme song alone kept the family culturally alive in between every reunion and revival. It's been reworked for a rap remix tied to the 1991 feature film licensed for a tea commercial, and parodied on a British sketch show decades after its original recording session in a studio too cheap to hire real singers. The family even made it to Broadway in 2010 as a full-stage musical, built the entire time on the same characters a cartoonist once refused to name. The family's reach kept expanding long after its original cancellation in 1966. In 1972, most of the original cast returned to voice an episode of the new Scooby-Doo movies called Wednesday is Missing, with a young Jodie Foster stepping in to voice Pugsley. Foster returned again the following year when the animated Addams Family series launched in its own right, giving the family its first full life outside live-action television. Decades after that, a new generation met the family all over again through a moody teenage take on Wednesday herself, one that even echoed a dance Lisa Loring improvised on the original show back when she was 5 years old. A small detail from a low-budget 1960s set, still shaping how the character moves on screen today. Maybe that's the actual lesson hiding inside one crooked left hand caught on camera in 1965. The show was never trying to look flawless. It was trying to feel alive, made by people improvising their way through budget limits and a punishing schedule, actors ad-libbing their way into signature lines, a composer faking a trio with his own overdubbed voice, a mansion borrowed from a movie about a shipwreck. Every uncorrected mistake left in the final cut is proof that it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. 60 years later, nobody remembers this show for its budget or its ratings, or the rival series that briefly outdrew it. They remember it for exactly the kind of imperfect human moment that a bigger, more careful production would have quietly edited away. Now that you know Thing was switching hands on purpose, what other detail do you think slipped past everyone for 60 years? Share with us in the comments below if you ever noticed something else. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.